Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Bang Soup. I'm truly excited to have our guest on today, Mr. Jason Safford. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Dexter. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. Really excited to have you. So, one thing that I think is really, really interesting about what you do, you recently wrote a book called Win the Day. And you talked about building a blueprint that really helps people get over crisis, burnout. You have an entire architect that's surrounding that idea. Tell us a little bit about that and how you got started.
Sure. So, Win Your Day is a book that goes far beyond self help. I like to think of it as a blueprint for human reinvention. And it acknowledges that crisis is an opportunity to transform into a better version of yourself. And this is something that I both personally experienced as well as helped lots of people through during the pandemic, that some of us may or may not want to remember just a few years ago. But during that time, a lot of people reached out to me as an executive coach who were going through both a personal crisis as well as a crisis with their teams in transition, going from in person to remote work. And so I became a support system for them. And I was honored to be able to have that privilege. And in the process, I got to work with people on both their internal as well as external transition. And that's how the book Win Your Day was really developed, was both what I was going through personally as well as what I was experiencing as a coach working with other people and understanding the crisis that they were facing and how to help them not only get through that crisis, but really look at the other side of crisis and what is the opportunity? Who do you want to become? How do you want to move forward and grow forward with your life? As well as all of the ways in which you can impact the world around you more successfully by using that crisis as a way to build.
It's so interesting when people talk about crisis and different trials and tribulations that happen in our lives. How would you define crisis? Because I feel like sometimes people get to a place where they're constantly in fight or flight mode and don't realize that they might be in a crisis moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're always in crisis, especially at the beginning of our lives when we're first starting out. And yes, as babies, I did not necessarily mean that in inference. I was talking about more as adults. But yeah, as babies, we're in crisis and we depend on our parents and caretakers to be able to help us. And ironically enough, from a psychology standpoint, that's where a lot of our trauma is actually induced, which shapes the better part of our lives. But as young adults, crisis is going out into the world and having to fend for yourself without your parents. And for a lot of us, as we go through life, we don't necessarily build upon those early moments of crisis. We kind of stay in fight or flight mode to your standpoint. So our trajectory is really limited by the frequency of survival that we're stuck in. And so that's one of the opportunities in the book, is really looking at where are you basically, transmitting from? Are you transmitting from a, frequency of survival? And, is that coming across to everyone and everything in your path, which is what really gives you a lot of the, encounters that you face, is how you're projecting yourself. So if you're projecting yourself from that standpoint of survival mode, you're constantly in crisis and everybody around you feels that crisis. So unless you want to elevate yourself and really get out of that crisis mode, that's going to be one of the challenges that you face with, being able to transform.
What would you say to somebody who they really want to get over whatever trials and tribulations they're going through currently, but they don't know how to get over those challenges, and they don't even know how to recognize, as you were saying, is this something that comes from my childhood? Is this something that I picked up along the way? Is it a combination of both, or is it just natural to who I am?
So it's another great question that you ask, because this is something we all face. And that is, where did my trauma come from? And how do I remove the block in front of me when I don't necessarily know how to do that? So it's easy as me as a coach to tell you that's why you need a coach. But sitting here with you right now, for those people who don't have the coaches or don't even have access or ability, what I'm going to tell you for them is that it begins with very, very small micro steps, in a sense. And here's what I mean. Let's use the example of someone who wants to get in shape. That's the easiest one always. I'm a fitness coach on top of everything else. And for someone who wants to get into shape, the first step is always the hardest. They put it off to tomorrow. They say, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it. Until eventually they're the broken record that they hate. Okay? So start with one push-up. Can you do one push-up? I don't know how to do a push-up. Okay. Lie on the ground. Put your hands at your chest and push. Can you do those things for yourself? Whether or not you get yourself off the ground, making that effort is the first step. And if you do that every day, if you just lie down on the ground, put your hands at your chest and push until you lift yourself up, the consistency with which you do that small micro step is the first most important part of being able to remove anything. Okay? It goes on from there. There's a lot that I can unravel and unpack from that. But it's really understanding that it does start with one very simple step. And the more you do it and the more you ingrain it into your, mental framework of, I'm going to commit to this one action every day. Okay, let's take something a lot more difficult. Okay, let's take something like addiction, and let's use alcohol addiction because, again, it's probably one of the most prevalent diseases, okay, that exists under a legal framework of being able to drink responsibly. Okay, so for that person who knows that they drink too much or that their dependency on drinking is unhealthy, how do you stop? It's easy to say, I need to quit. It's easy to say, I shouldn't have this extra drink. But being able to convert that energy into actual matter is something as simple as saying, I'm not going to go to this party because I know I'm going to be around people who are going to drink and they're going to encourage me to do so. Okay. Now that sounds easy, right? And I said it's as easy as, but in practice, the difficulty is simply going from the conversion of energy of thinking it to doing it. And it's those small micro steps of being able to say to yourself without doing anything too heavy, what can I do? That just by that little process that I can do, I win. And now I can put the next step in front of me and I can win by each step. And so in the book, a lot of what I do is I tell stories or share stories from leaders that you know. So, for example, I start the book with Theodore Roosevelt, who, for a lot of people, they don't realize that his entire life was crisis. This is a guy who started as an asthmatic in the 19th century, before we had a lot of the medications and equipment and resources to help someone with asthma. Okay, so he was not expected to live past childhood. And yet he became one of the most impressive figures in American history in addition to being president of this country. Okay. Now, when you unravel all that, you can love him or hate him, but what you have to respect about him is that he used his crisis to transform. And he went from building his body to then having to experience a very traumatic crisis of losing his wife and his mother on the same day and having to rebuild his spirit. Okay. And then from there, he went into crisis with going into war, and he had to rebuild his emotions as a leader. And then from there, he had to rebuild his emotional, ability to handle the responsibility that was led, to his leadership as the president of the United States. So he went through several different crises in which each aspect of what I call resilience architecture, each pillar he had to rebuild and make it stronger so that he could embody resilience and success for everybody around him.
Jason, I love the way that you interweave the concepts behind energy, emotions, and philosophy, and how that gets interpreted into matter, into our reality. You talk a lot about that first step being the hardest in these micro steps. When we dive into some of these micro habits, as I know you've said before, that some of these high performers have, how do you get someone to shift their mindset from being a day-to-day person to achieving such high goals, such as becoming president or being a Fortune 500 CEO?
Another great question. There's no ideal solution to that answer, to that question, or there's no ideal answer to that question. There are lots of different pathways, and a lot of people know a book called Atomic Habits. And it's very funny because I grew up with that without the book being existing, understanding that if you do anything just a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more, you're going to get fairly good at it. And it's easy with sports, it's easy with music to understand it. But the way that I really like to explain it to people now is that you have 24 hours in a day. And when you break that down into minutes and seconds, you get to an enormous number. Okay. Now, 1% of one day in seconds comes out to 15 minutes. Okay. So 1% of your day dedicated to any one habit, 15 minutes a day, is something that most people can do. Going back to exercise, can you exercise for 15 minutes a day? If you can't, start with 1 minute. Work your way up to 15 minutes so that you can then say, hey, you know what? I accomplished something that takes up 1% of my day. Okay? And you could even break it down. You can do 15 minutes of exercise in a day. You can simply do it 1 minute at a time for 15 hours if you want. So in the course of 15 hours, if you do exercise for 1 minute of each hour, you've done it. Now that leaves only 7 hours of sleep. So, you got to factor and budget how you're going to actually do this. But there are ways to break it down. Okay. Now that's exercise. Can you read for 15 minutes a day? Can you listen for 15 minutes a day? Can you focus yourself in any activity that you're interested in for 15 minutes a day? And if you can do that, then can you find something that you're not good at, that you struggle with, and can you work on that for 15 minutes a day? So when you're able to then break things down from a real logical perspective of what you're capable of doing, then it's not so hard. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, that we see things in their totality. And that's the block that prevents us from moving forward. And when we're able to really break it apart and look at what that totality is really made up of, you realize that it's almost like a lot of people may not remember this, but Tetris game. I don't know if Tetris is still around anymore, but it's a matter of identifying and moving the pieces around so that they fit into the puzzle and you can get through layer by layer to, be able to win the game. And so if you think about that in terms of your day, it's all Tetris. You simply have to figure out what are the things that are easy for you to do and what are the things that are hard for you to do, and how do you block out that time to focus on those things in a way that you can enjoy or that you don't struggle with.
I love that. I agree with that. I do think it's very much like Tetris. One thing that I usually tell people is just get started. Just tell yourself you're only going to do it for 5 minutes. And what typically happens is the 5 minutes, you look at the clock, it's been 20, 30, 40 minutes, and you enter the state of flow. So as we talk about things such as being in flow and diving into addiction a little bit further, what would you say to a very large population of people who are addicted to social media, their cell phones, and that's where that wasted time goes, where they could be doing other things? How do you break someone away from this addiction and give them the motivation to pursue their own goals?
Great question. I can't say that I necessarily have an easy answer for that. Uh, I can tell you what works for me. But before I tell you what works for me, what I do want to preface this with is to help people understand that they need to ask themselves, why? Why is this important to me? And so, in prefacing that, I'll now tell you that for me, I put the phone down whenever I can. I try not to use the cell phone other than for business or for real contact. In fact, I was just joking with a client that what I use my cell phone for more than anything else now is timers, because I'm constantly setting timers with myself, my kids, my clients, and my business. And the reason is because I only have a certain amount of time in every day. And to that point of what I just shared with 1%, I do it with myself all the time. I'm constantly on the clock because I have to get from task to task and agenda to agenda. And within that, I'm also making sure I carve out time for myself and my family, which are the two most important things in my life. So it's easy for me to say, just put the phone down, because I do it. But for somebody who's really struggling with it, I want them to start with asking, why is this important to me? Because oftentimes we're doing something unconsciously. And that's the biggest problem that we all face, especially with something as distracting as social media. So I want to just lead into that because I know you got another question to follow this up. But our number one crisis, especially here in America, but growing worldwide, is distraction. That's our number one crisis. And the results are obesity, disease, and overall discomfort with our lives because we're distracted. And we can blame any number of factors. The easiest, we can blame our lack of money, our lack of time, or our lack of relationships. Okay? All three of those things come back to why. Why is this important to me? When you say you don't have enough money, why is it important to you to have so much money? When you say you don't have enough time, why is it important to you to have more time? When you don't have a good relationship, why is it important to you to have a good relationship? When you ask those questions, you can then reevaluate what you're doing. Is this in my best interest? Is this making me happy?
I love that, and it's It's so true what you say that how is almost never as important as the why. We have to truly define why we're doing anything in this life. And a lot of times what I've found is people just haven't sat back and given themselves enough time and space in order to reevaluate, in order to see if what's going on in their lives are still in alignment. How does somebody who already struggles to find time in their day to do what could be considered extracurricular activities? I don't know what someone's life is looking like, but maybe they want to start a business. Maybe they want to take a vacation. They want to do these things. How do you get someone to sit down and say, hey, why do you want to do that when they're already so jumbled in their mind?
Another great question. The challenge that I find when I'm speaking with someone who I'm trying to coach or is interested in working with me in any capacity is first getting to the root of what they're struggling with. And 95% of the time, if not more, they have no idea. So that's our first challenge is if you don't have an idea what you really want to do, and you're just doing things because you were told to do them, you were trained to do them, you followed somebody else, okay? We have a bigger problem because I can't help you do something that you don't even know that you want to do. So step back and look at it from the standpoint of most people who are in business. Those who are successful usually modeled somebody else's success, right? And they were able to achieve a certain amount of success for themselves. That's the practical statement. But underneath the surface, most of those successful people are not happy because they modeled somebody else and they get to a certain point where they realize they're not doing what they want to do. They're not doing what they enjoy. They're not even doing something they want to enjoy. They're doing something because they watch somebody else do it or ask somebody else to teach them how to do it because they had an objective in mind. That objective was not the work. That objective was a result that would come from doing the work. And what they find out over time is they're no closer to their objective after they've achieved the success than they were before because they were modeling somebody else's formula. They weren't creating their own formula. So a lot of people who say, well, I need to get money or I need more time. Again, unless you go back to why do you want to do this? What is the bigger picture that you envision that, okay, you may not be able to do it right now because you don't have the money or the time, but you know what you want to be able to work towards. Okay. So let's use a simple example. When you're young, you have all these grand ideas of how you're going to make money to be able to build the luxurious life you want in the future. Okay. Now you build the luxurious life through hard work and sweat, and you're still not happy. What was it that got missed in that whole formula? And that is, why did you want that luxurious life in the future? Was it about you? Was it about your family? Was it about something that you would be able to achieve? And you have to be able to go back and recognize where the disconnect was. For the answer to the question that you are really looking for young people, it's a matter of planning before you get started. So if your goal is, I want to be able to have a nice house, a family, a dog or a cat, a nice living, what does that mean? How are you building that in a way that the people that are participating in that with you are feeding you the way you're feeding them.
Diving more into that, right? I love the way that you place that. This become the architect of your own life. Because a lot of what you're talking about is, turning this crisis and not everything into the architecture. But you're really talking about starting with the blueprint and having a strong foundation. As we know, no building is going to be sturdy without a very solid foundation. A lot of times people think that foundation has to do with something very physical and tangible, but you're talking more about happiness, joy, the emotions, and feelings behind it. So what role does that play into building, constructing that future? And how do we get there when we don't want to overwhelm somebody with the totality of the task?